for being here today. My name is Peggy Nash. I'm a board member of the Broadbent Institute, and I'm very pleased today to be here with Nils Schmid, who is the Foreign Affairs spokesperson for the SPD in Germany. And today we're going to be discussing voting structure, which is a topic we've had a lot of discussion about here in Canada. So welcome, Nils. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Yeah, thank you for having me here. Yeah.
So we talk a lot in Canada about our voting system because we have frequently a situation where a party can get the support of maybe 30-odd% of the population and win a majority government and really not have to cooperate with any other parties, which doesn't really seem fair to most people. So my first question is, can you tell us about the voting system in Germany? What is the structure? How does it look? And what does the ballot actually look like for voters?
Well, in Germany you have a voting system based on proportional representation. That means that every party that gets more than 5% of the vote has a representation in parliament. And so it more or less really represents the political will of the population, at least of those participating in the ballot. But there is a very important feature to that, meaning that you can also win a so-called direct mandate in your district. And if you win this mandate, you are certain to be member of parliament. But the number of these direct mandates is subtracted from the total number of the seats your party wins according to a proportional representation.
So just if I understand what you're saying, the direct mandate would be how we elect our members of parliament here. So you get one vote and it is for who you want to be the member of parliament, the person who gets the most votes wins.
That's the first past the post voting system, and that's for the direct mandate in your district, and that's why you have two ballots, two votes to cast. One is for your preferred candidate in the district, and the second one is for the party you want to see elected into parliament. And it's called the first vote and the second vote. And the second vote is the decisive vote for the total number of seats a party wins on the national level. And the first vote is only for the candidates in your district, and you can split the vote. So if you prefer to have a social democrat to win the district, you can do that, while giving the second vote, for example, to the Green Party, if you want them to be sure to be qualified for representation in parliament. And so there's a tactical aspect to voting in Germany, especially for smaller parties, in order to assure them of being qualified, of overcoming the so-called 5% hurdle. Some voters split. Especially if they are in the same camp. So if they are in the progressive camp, you might see voters giving the first vote to a social democrat and the second vote to the Greens. And for the conservative camp, you might see a voter giving the second vote to the Liberal Party and the first vote to the Christian Democratic Party, which is a conservative party. But as I've said, the basic principle is proportional representation. And ideally, we have a parliament which consists of half of its members being directly elected in a district and half of it being elected according to a list which sort of fills the gap of those seats that are not distributed among directly elected candidates of the same party. But it's very important to sort of equalize the whole of the system in order to maintain the proportionality of the result on the national level.
So everybody just gets one member of parliament in their area. But then there are additional members who are chosen from a party list to make up that proportion.
Yeah, right. And these lists are provincial lists. There is no federal list, but it's a list which is voted by a party convention on the provincial level. So in my case, it's Baden-Württemberg state, and this is very important because it has a federal or federalist touch to the whole system. And in my district, because of this system, we have one direct mandate which went to the Conservatives, and 3 other candidates got their mandate, their seat, through the list. Me as a Social Democrat, a Liberal woman, also got elected thanks to the list, and a Green MP also. So you might have up to 6 members of parliament in one district, which is an extreme example, but since there are 6 parties represented in parliament, you might have up to 6 MPs in one district.
I see. So can you describe the relationship between a directly elected member and a party list member? In other words, who, I mean, as a former MP, it was important for me to be accountable to my district, my riding, but I'm assuming if you come from a list because you were elected by your party, as it were, you're not so locally based, you're tied more to your party. What's the relationship between the two?
There is a tendency, or the tendency you described is very much present in the German political system. So those who win or who hope to win a direct mandate are very much present in their district, in their riding. On the other hand, those who got elected via the list, they also have to be nominated as a candidate by their local party organization. So they also have an incentive to be very much present in the district as well. And legally, both types of MPs have the same rights, of course. But what you can tell from experience is that the larger parties, the catch-all parties, like the big parties like the Christian Democrats and the Social Democrats, usually tend to be much more present in the districts than the smaller parties, because they have the ambition to represent large parts of society, and that's why with some exceptions, you see rather Christian Democrats or Social Democrats really fighting in the district. In some districts, urban districts, big cities, you have the Greens that are now also competing for the direct mandate, and in some university towns, you saw Green candidates winning the direct mandate. But still, there is a sort of tendency, as I've described. Yeah.
So what does that mean in terms of the influence of, say, the Social Democrats? Yeah. Social Democrats are in power now nationally in Germany, and you have a history of being in power. Can you just talk a bit about what that has meant in terms of actually winning government, or even when you are not the dominant party, when you have joined with another party to form government?
Yeah. So usually proportional representation results in coalition governments. Normally you do not win an outright majority, an absolute majority of seats in a proportional electoral system. There were some exceptions, notably on the provincial level, but on the federal level, except for the very beginning of the West German Federal Republic, there have always been coalition governments, either consisting of 2 parties. Now, since last September, for the first time, we have a 3-party coalition government on the federal level. But so German politics sort of got used to coalition politics.
Here, coalition has been this dirty word that gets thrown out.
There's nothing dirty about it. You just have to respect the will of the electorate. But you need also to be ready for compromise. And so usually you do not get 100% of your party platform in a coalition agreement. And coalition agreement is a very good point, because more and more these coalition partners tend to try to find guarantees for their political projects, their pet projects, via the coalition agreement, which leads to coalition agreements that encompass more than 150 pages. So relatively detailed information about the bills that are going to be prepared in specific policy fields. And I took part in the working group on foreign policy with my foreign policy colleagues from the Liberals and the Green Party in order to form this new government. And we really worked through all fields of foreign policy: defense, human rights, humanitarian aid, development aid, the armed forces, regional chapters dedicated to China, the Indo-Pacific. And then there's a huge chapter on the European Union itself. So very complex, but it serves as a guideline for the legislative process in the term, in the 4 years, in our 4-year term. And it also helps to build trust, because when you sit together for 6 weeks and you negotiate certain topics, you also find some common human ground, some sense of committee and of shared values, and you get to know each other, and there's a lot of confidence building going on in these negotiations. And German politics is not so adversarial. So the major political forces know that if push comes to shove, you need to accept a compromise and you need to build a coalition. And
so it reduces that polarization, perhaps.
And well, it's much easier to build a coalition, I would say, in the same political camp. So if progressive parties join forces, it's a much more positive note to the negotiation and to the agreement. But sometimes you have to form a coalition across the aisle. So what we call a grand coalition between Social Democrats and Conservatives.
For many years.
Yeah, we had to do that for many years because we had a very diverse parliament. But for many years in Germany, you had only 3 or 4 parties represented in parliament. And so all these 4 parties were used to get along with one another. And because of our federal system, provincial elections and the formation of provincial coalition governments serve as a sort of laboratorium for new political constellations. So in the 60s, the Social Democrats for the first time formed a coalition government with the Liberal Party in one of the big provinces, North Rhine-Westphalia, the Ruhr area. And then some years later, they did the same on the federal level. And we had the same history with the Social Democratic Green coalition. It started on the provincial level in some provinces, and then in 1998, for the first time, a Social Democratic Green coalition, so-called Red-Green coalition, was put together on the federal level. And the same is true for the current constellation, what we call a traffic light coalition. You could also call it a Lithuania coalition because it's the colors of the Lithuanian flag. So it's red, Green and Yellow. Green Party, Social Democratic Party, and the Liberal Party, they are the yellow ones. And this coalition was for the first time put up as an experiment in one rather small province, and it worked out well. And now and then we were courageous enough, brave enough to do it on the federal level.
That's really interesting. So it's replicated provincially and federally.
Yeah, but you have a diversity of coalition across the nation. So in the second chamber, the so-called Bundesrat, which represents the provincial governments, you have no clear-cut majority. And so this also helps us to bring about political compromises.
I want to ask you about that, because here our second chamber is an appointed chamber. It's modeled after the House of Lords in Britain, and it is appointed. The NDP is not particularly favorable to that. It's undemocratic. And so
I understand that.
So perhaps can you just describe how the second chamber is formed in Germany?
Yeah, it's not completely democratic either, unfortunately, because it has a long tradition in German history, in German federal, or in the history of German federalism, because the second chamber, the so-called Bundesrat, the federal council, represents not parliamentarians, or is not formed of parliamentarians. They represent the provincial governments. So what you find in the Bundesrat and the second chamber are representatives of provincial governments, meaning governors and ministers from provinces. And the voting weight is according to their population. So you have bigger states, bigger provinces, they have up to 5 votes in the second chamber, and small ones, they might have, 3 votes. And so it's a indirect democratic legitimation. It's better than a purely appointed chamber, but it is not a directly elected chamber as the Senate in the US, for example. And but this is linked to the specifics of the German federal system. The German federalism is about sharing competences between the federal level and provinces.
As Canada is.
Yeah, but in a very specific, particular way. Most legislation is done by the federal level, by the Bundestag, and the second chamber, the Bundesrat, whereas most laws are administered by provincial governments. So the idea of the Bundesrat is to bring in the administrative experience of provincial governments in formulating laws on the federal level. And that's why the executive branch of provincial governments is represented in the Bundesrat. So a provincial parliament has not so much legislating power, but they have to administer federal laws, and they have to staff public administration, to pay for them, to pay for the pensions of public administration. So there's a clear-cut division of labor. Legislation is more or less a federal job. Administration, public administration in Germany is more or less a job left to provinces and municipalities.
So you now form the national government, the federal government, but can you talk about other recent electoral breakthroughs in Germany by the SPD?
Yes, well, we won the last provincial election in the Saar, which is a small area close to the French border. And this was one of the rare examples of one party winning the absolute majority of seats. So that was quite a feat. And we also are holding, I would say, a plurality of provincial governments, but in very different coalitions. So sometimes we team up with conservatives. Sometimes we have a 3-party coalition on the provincial level, and we are very hopeful for the next regional elections in the biggest province, North Rhine-Westphalia, in May, that we will win it back, because of the Ruhr, is a heavily industrialized area, and for many decades it was governed by the SPD, and we hope to bring it back into our realm.
Well, that sounds very positive. Best wishes to you with that, and thank you so much for helping us understand better a system that to me seems more democratic than our own, and I think we have a lot to learn from the German system. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having me.